For nearly 100 years, Cambodia was a kingdom under so-called French protection. But after World War II, that was all about to change. The desire for real freedom was just undeniable. This is the story of how Cambodia won its independence, not through some single, simple revolution, but through a messy, three-way power struggle, a fight between politicians, guerrillas, and one brilliant young king. And it's a struggle that would, tragically, set the stage for everything that came later.
Okay, so let's set the scene. It's 1945. The Japanese, who had occupied Cambodia during the war, have just given the kingdom a kind of symbolic independence. But almost immediately, French forces roll right back into Phnom Penh. So you've got this country that's just had a taste of freedom, a population that's buzzing with all these nationalist ideas, and a colonial power that's trying to put the genie back in the bottle. The big question on everyone's mind was, what happens now?
You know, the French knew they couldn't just turn back the clock. Nationalism was in the air, so they started offering concessions. After that little taste of independence in the summer of '45, the French came back, but by early 1946, a deal was on the table. Cambodia could have a constitution, it could have political parties, but, and this is a big but, things like defense and foreign affairs, those stayed firmly in French hands. It was a path to self-rule, sure, but a path paved and controlled entirely by Paris.
So how did this all shake out? Well, we're going to look at three completely different visions for Cambodia's future. You had the Democrats in the capital, the revolutionaries out in the forest, and this incredibly cunning young king who was about to outmaneuver them all. We're going to see who won, how they locked down their power, and what dangerous seeds were being planted for the country's future.
All right, first up, let's talk about the Democrats. Back in the capital, you had this new generation of politicians who really believed that Cambodia's future could be built not with bullets, but with ballots and debate.
So two main parties pop up. And interestingly, they're both led by princes, but they had totally different ideas. You can see here, on one side, you've got the Democrats, led by the French-educated Prince Yuthavong. They were all about immediate total independence. Now. On the other side, you had the conservative liberals who wanted to take it much, much slower and keep those close ties with France. And when Cambodia held its first ever national election in 1946, the results were just wow. It was an absolute landslide for the Democrats. They took 50 out of 67 seats. I mean, this wasn't just some political victory, this was a national mandate. The Cambodian people had spoken, and the message could not have been clearer. We want independence, and we want it now.
But here's the huge dilemma they faced. The Democrats had this massive popular support, but at the end of the day, they were fundamentally powerless. They couldn't deliver on their number one promise because France held all the real cards. And that frustration, it led to all this internal bickering and political infighting, which just completely weakened their position. They had a parliament, sure, but a parliament with no real power.
So while all these politicians were debating in the capital, a very different idea of independence was taking root out in the countryside. For these folks, freedom wasn't going to be negotiated in some fancy assembly hall. It was going to be won with a gun out in the forest.
This movement was called the Khmer Issarak, which basically means Free Khmer. At first, they were this kind of loose-knit collection of guerrilla fighters, getting some initial backing from Thailand. And their platform was pretty simple. They hated French rule, and they really didn't trust the monarchy, which they just saw as a puppet for the colonialists.
But the Issarak movement didn't stay disorganized for long. Over time, a much more organized, more ideological faction started to take over, one that was heavily influenced by Vietnamese communists. By 1951, this all led to the creation of the Khmer People's Revolutionary Party, or KPRP. And here's the crucial bit of foreshadowing. This small, radical party would one day become infamous all over the world as the Khmer Rouge. The seeds of a much, much darker revolution were already being planted.
So, we've got a deadlocked parliament in the city and a growing rebellion in the jungle. Now, enter player number 3, the one who's about to flip the whole board over, Cambodia's young, ambitious, and politically brilliant King Norodom Sihanouk.
This quote from Sihanouk himself in 1952 really tells you everything you need to know about his mindset. He looked at the democratic government and just saw chaos and incompetence. He believed that if he didn't do something, the country would either fall apart or the real patriots, the armed fighters, would win. He decided he had to grab control of the independence movement for himself.
And what he does next is just a masterclass in political maneuvering. It's a 4-step plan. First, he just gets rid of the Democrats in a royal coup. Boom, they're gone. Second, he dissolves the whole assembly, giving himself absolute power. Third, he becomes his own best diplomat, traveling the world, shaming the French on the international stage. And then, for his final move, he goes into this self-imposed exile, flat out refusing to return until the French gave in. It was an incredibly gutsy move.
And you know what? It completely paid off. The war in Vietnam was going badly for the French, international pressure was building, and they just caved. In October 1953, they handed over the last bits of colonial control. King Sihanouk returned to Phnom Penh not just as a king, but as the undisputed hero, the father of independence, who had done what nobody else could.
So, getting independence is one thing, but holding on to power, that's a whole other ballgame. Now we're going to see how Sihanouk used all this new prestige to build a political order that was centered entirely around him. The political chessboard was just completely wiped clean and rearranged. Sihanouk was the obvious winner. His main rivals, the Democrats, were suddenly irrelevant. He'd basically stolen their main issue right out from under them. The Communists, totally frozen out, forced back underground. And in their place, conservative guys loyal to the king, men like Lon Nol, were suddenly being put into positions of real power.
Now, to really lock down his rule, Sihanouk did something pretty wild. He abdicated the throne. He handed it to his father so that he could get directly into politics himself. He created a new political movement called the Sangkum. And in the 1955 elections, surrounded by reports of harassment and intimidation against any opposition, his Sangkum won this just staggering victory, taking every single seat in the assembly.
So on the surface, Sihanouk's victory was absolute. He had essentially created a one-party state with himself right at the center of everything. But that opposition, both the Democrats and the Communists, they hadn't just vanished. As this later image really hints out, they had just been suppressed. They were pushed underground, where all that resentment would just fester and wait for its moment.
Okay, so this brings us to the legacy of Sihanouk's independence crusade. The period when he ruled is often looked back on as this golden age of peace and prosperity. But what was the real cost of all that stability?
Well, as historian David Chandler puts it, Sihanouk's style of rule was intensely personal and totally authoritarian. He demanded absolute loyalty. He didn't treat his opponents as rivals, he treated them as traitors, and by crushing all legitimate political opposition, he basically closed off any path for peaceful debate or change. He left only one option for people who disagreed with him: extremism.
And so that's the question we're left with. Sihanouk's royal crusade was a political masterpiece, no doubt about it. He delivered independence, and for a while, he kept his country out of the brutal wars that were tearing up its neighbors. But by creating a system where all power came from one man and all opposition was treason, he might have, completely unwittingly, paved the road for the very people who would one day destroy everything he had ever built.